Good evening, traveler. Tonight, we are leaving behind the glow of modern life, our screens, our thermostats, our sense that comfort is normal, and stepping into a world that made no such promises. A world where the word wild did not describe adventure, it described survival. Welcome to the real American West of the 1870s. You have seen it countless times in movies. A lone rider galloping across golden plains, a sunset glowing behind a small town of promise, a saloon door swinging as the hero steps in. It is cinematic, dramatic, and deeply satisfying. But what if I told you that the truth of that world was far quieter, harder, and infinitely more human? Tonight, let us take off the Hollywood lens and look closely at what life in the frontier really felt like, day by exhausting day. Imagine waking before dawn in a one-room cabin you built yourself, the walls thin enough to whisper the night wind's secrets. The air bites at your skin, and your first breath is heavy with the scent of dust, smoke, and something unmistakably organic. Because in this world there is no escaping the smell of life unfiltered. Your bed is a sack of straw that crunches as you move, the pillow a folded coat. You have slept poorly, because the fire went out hours ago, and the chills seeped through every board. There is no gentle alarm clock. The rooster and the ache in your back are all the reminders you need that morning has come. Before you can even think about breakfast, there is work. Always work. The cattle must be fed before the sun rises too high. The stove must be lit, water hauled from the well, wood chopped, children stirred from sleep. If you are lucky, you have a few hours before the heat becomes punishing. If not, you are already sweating under layers of rough cloth, because there is no such thing as breathable fabric here. This is not a life of adventure. It is a test of endurance, of how much a person can adapt when comfort does not exist yet. The movies make the Wild West look heroic, but in truth, it was closer to an endless balancing act between effort and exhaustion. Every luxury we take for granted today, clean water, steady meals, electricity, medicine, refrigeration, was either non-existent or a miracle reserved for the few who lived near bigger towns. For everyone else, survival depended on two things: the weather and your own persistence. And the weather, well, it was rarely on your side. Winters could freeze a bucket of water solid inside your house. Summers could boil it on the porch. Dust storms rolled in without warning, blinding travelers and choking livestock. Rain meant relief and ruin. In equal measure, it could fill your well or flood your fields in a single night. The West did not care whether you were a good person or a bad one, a dreamer or a drifter. It tested everyone equally. Even the air carried weight here. It was not just the physical labor that wore people down. It was the awareness that help, if you needed it, was miles away. A broken wagon wheel, a twisted ankle, or a sudden illness could turn into a crisis, with no one to call, no pharmacy, no hospital. You were your own doctor, carpenter, mechanic, and sometimes even your own priest. Daily life followed a rhythm dictated not by the clock, but by survival's checklist. Wake, work, eat what you have, repair what is broken, sleep when you can. And yet, within that repetition, there was a strange kind of peace. People spoke less, worried less about appearances, and lived close enough to nature to hear it breathe. The silence of the plains was both a companion and a challenge. It forced you to confront yourself without distraction. That is another myth worth unlearning. The idea that the Wild West was always noisy with gunfire and saloon music. In reality, most of the frontier was defined by silence. Long, unbroken days of wind, animal calls, and the rhythmic sound of tools striking earth. The tension people carried was not cinematic. It was internal. Would the next harvest fail? Would disease reach your settlement? Would someone you love survive the winter? Those were the real showdowns. And then there were the nights vast, star-filled and humbling. When darkness fell, it fell completely. The horizon disappeared. The world shrank to the small glow of your lamp and the breathing of the people beside you. Some found that stillness beautiful. Others found it unbearable. There is a reason so many diaries from the time speak of the loneliness of the plains. It was not just distance that isolated people, it was the realization of how small one person feels under an infinite sky. Still, people came. They came by the thousands, drawn by land, by gold, by the rumor that a better life waited beyond the next ridge. Some arrived with families, others alone. Some were escaping poverty or persecution, others were chasing wealth or reinvention. The West offered both, depending on how much you could endure. It was, in every sense, a gamble. But even gamblers knew that survival depended on cooperation. The romantic image of the lone cowboy overlooks the fact that most people could not make it through a single season without help. Neighbors built each other's barns, shared seeds, traded tools, and looked after each other's children. If someone fell ill, others took over their chores. Mutual aid was not charity, it was the only insurance policy that existed. And maybe that is the truest measure of the Wild West. Not how hard life was, but how people found ways to make it livable anyway. Amid the hardship, they created songs, told stories, celebrated harvests, and found humor in the absurdities of weather and luck. Evenings by the fire were not about luxury, they were about claiming a few hours of humanity after a day spent bargaining with the earth. So when we imagine the Wild West tonight, let us strip away the silver screen polish and remember the texture of reality: rough wood, coarse fabric, bitter coffee, and honest exhaustion. Let us remember that every legend we know began with someone who simply refused to give up, who patched the roof again, who planted despite the drought, who faced another dawn because there was no alternative. And as you settle into your own comfort tonight, your clean sheets, your temperature-controlled room, let yourself feel a quiet kind of gratitude, not guilt, not pity, but recognition. The conveniences that cradle us now were born from the hardships of people who had none. They did not all survive, but they all contributed through labor, loss, and resilience to the world we inherited. The Wild West was not wild because of its violence or freedom. It was wild because every moment demanded courage, the courage to endure the ordinary. So take a deep breath, listener. Hear the wind across that endless prairie. Smell the wood smoke curling from a cabin chimney. Feel the weight of history pressing through the dark. Tonight we are not glorifying the frontier. We are remembering it the way it really was: tough, raw, imperfect, and human. And maybe, as we drift into sleep, that is the lesson worth keeping. That survival, in any century, begins with humility. Last night, we fell asleep beneath the stars of the American frontier, the same stars that guided settlers, dreamers, and wanderers a century and a half ago. Tonight, we open our eyes again in that same world and discover what home truly meant when comfort was a luxury most people could not afford. You rise from your straw mattress, stiff and sore. The floorboards creak beneath your feet, though floorboards might be too generous a word. They are uneven planks, some warped by damp, some cracked by frost, all carrying the scent of dust and smoke. The fire has long since gone cold, and the air bites with the chill of morning. If it is winter, you see your breath. If it is summer, you feel sweat already gathering at your collar. Either way, the temperature is not something you control. It is something you survive. The movies show frontier cabins as warm and rustic, with golden light spilling through windows. But most settlers did not have glass at all, just thin parchment or animal hide stretched across the frame to keep out the wind. When storms came, they did not knock politely. The wind screamed through every gap, and rain crept in wherever it could find a way. And yet, this was home. A place built not for beauty, but for endurance. There is no plumbing, no running water, no bathroom. If you need water, you fetch it bucket after bucket from the nearest well or stream, no matter the season. In winter, you break the ice first. In summer, you walk farther, because the stream might have dried up. Each trip weighs about 40 pounds. And you will make it many times a day for cooking, washing, drinking, cleaning, and sometimes for the animals too. Bathing, meanwhile, is an event, not a routine. Most families shared a single wooden tub, using the same water from oldest to youngest. Soap was handmade and scarce, often harsh enough to dry and crack the skin. Some settlers went months without a full bath, saving water for survival instead of cleanliness. They did not smell bad to each other. Everyone shared the same scent of sweat, smoke, leather, and dust. It was simply life. If you lived in a town, you might find a public bathhouse, a place to wash for a small fee, but those were rare outside of mining camps or railroad stops. And even there, water was reused until it was murky. Hygiene was not neglect. It was an equation of scarcity. Breakfast, when it finally comes, is simple. Beans again, maybe biscuits, maybe a bit of dried meat, fresh fruit. A memory. Eggs, if your hens are kind. Milk, if your cow has not wandered off or gone dry. People did not expect variety. They expected calories. Enough fuel to get through another day of labor. And labor here is not symbolic. It is physical, repetitive, and relentless. The land does not care how tired you are. There is no paid leave, no weekend, no break for bad weather. You rise with the sun and stop when you can no longer see the tools in your hands. Every ache in your muscles is just a message from the body saying you are still alive. A farmer in the 1870s would plow from dawn to dusk, sometimes walking 15 miles behind an iron blade that fought every inch of prairie soil. A ranch hand might spend 14 hours in the saddle, guiding cattle through heat, dust, and thunder. A miner, working deep underground, breathed in more rock dust than air, and prayed the ceiling did not give way. There is no comfort in the modern sense. Even clothes are a compromise between practicality and punishment. Men wear stiff canvas trousers, heavy boots, and shirts that rub the skin raw. Women wear layers, chemise, corset, petticoat, long skirt, all beneath a sunbonnet that traps heat. The fabrics are coarse, the seams scratchy, and everything smells faintly of smoke. You do not wash your clothes often, because water is limited and soap costs money. But even discomfort becomes invisible when it is universal. No one complains because there is no one to complain to. You simply adapt. Pain becomes part of the landscape, like the wind or the dust. In towns, life offers small differences, but not necessarily better ones. Streets turn to mud after rain, and dust storms coat everything in a pale film. The air smells of horses, iron, and sweat. Flies are constant companions. Still, people find ways to live around the inconvenience. A saloon might offer music or laughter. A general store sells a taste of the East coffee, the sugar, maybe a tin of peaches that costs a day's wages. Little reminders that somewhere beyond these endless miles, civilization still exists. And yet, for all its hardship, the frontier had its own quiet dignity. Every board of a cabin, every fence post, every acre tilled by hand represented hours of perseverance. People built with what they had: logs, clay, stone, or sod, and in doing so built something more than shelter. They built permanence. Imagine, after a long day, sitting outside your small home as the sun sinks low. You are tired beyond words. The fields shimmer gold, the air hums with insects, and for a brief moment you feel at peace. Not the peace of leisure, but of purpose. The satisfaction that the day did not beat you. It is easy to think of those people as tough, and they were, but toughness was not a choice. It was the price of survival. Even so, they found room for humanity. They played music, told stories, shared laughter. Families gathered around a single candle, reading aloud from a worn Bible or an old book that had traveled hundreds of miles in a wagon chest. Children learned to find wonder in the smallest things: a shiny pebble, a bird's nest, a snowfall. Because even in struggle, people still needed beauty. And in a world without abundance, beauty was something you made yourself. So when we think about poor living conditions, we should not imagine only hardship, but also adaptation. The frontier was dirty, yes, but it was also ingenious. People reused everything: bones for buttons, ashes for soap, cloth for quilts, barrels for furniture. Nothing was wasted, because nothing could be. What we now call sustainability was simply necessity back then. And that is perhaps the most astonishing thing about the 1870s frontier: how ordinary people found ways to live with so little and still created lives full of meaning. They did not have comfort, but they had resilience. They did not have luxury, but they had resourcefulness. Every leak patched, every fence mended, every loaf baked on a wood stove was a declaration, quiet but firm, that they belonged here, however unforgiving the land might be. So as we drift through this world tonight, let us honor that endurance, not with nostalgia, but with respect. Because beneath the dust and discomfort, the American frontier was not just a place. It was a state of mind, a daily negotiation between hardship and hope. The day begins the same way it always does on the frontier, with a look toward the sky, because out here, the weather is not just background. It is the ruler of everything. Before you step outside, you check the color of the clouds, the direction of the wind, the smell in the air. These small signs decide what kind of day you will have, or whether you will have one at all. The sky is your calendar, your fortune teller, and your warning bell. In the 1870s American West, weather meant survival. A single storm could destroy a year's worth of crops. A drought could turn hope into dust. And a harsh winter could silence a whole valley before spring returned. There were no forecasts, no radio alerts, no satellite warnings. People learned to read the land instead. The way the grass bent, the way the birds flew lower before rain, the sudden stillness before a storm, that eerie quiet when even the animals stopped moving. If you were new to the frontier, you learned quickly, or the land would teach you the hard way. Imagine standing on a flat prairie in midsummer. The air feels heavy, thick, and endless. The horizon stretches in all directions, with no trees to offer shade, no hills to hide behind. Then, far away, you see it, a dark bruise of cloud swelling on the horizon. It grows fast, swallowing light. The wind shifts, cold and sharp. Within minutes, the sky turns greenish-gray, and lightning cracks open the world. You hurry to bring the animals in, to tie the shutters, to pray the roof holds. The rain comes not in drops, but in sheets, slamming against the walls like fists. The thunder does not roll, it shakes. Inside, you press your back to the wall, waiting, hoping. When it is over, you step outside and see the damage. Branches torn, fences down, the earth scarred by rivers that did not exist yesterday. And yet, when the sun returns, you start again, because there is no one else to fix what is broken. In winter, the rules change. The land hardens, the air thins, and silence becomes the dominant sound. Snow is not soft here. It is heavy, sharp, blinding. It buries trails, fences, sometimes entire homes. When storms last for days, families ration firewood and food carefully, marking each meal as both a comfort and a countdown. You burn anything that burns: old furniture, broken tools, even scraps of paper, because warmth means life. The world shrinks to the radius of your hearth, and every sound beyond the walls feels distant and strange, like another planet. Then there is drought, perhaps the cruelest of all frontier tests. It does not arrive with drama, but with absence. No rain, no dew. The grass fades from green to gray. Wells grow shallow. Cattle grow restless. Crops shrivel in their stalks. The ground cracks open, as if the earth itself were thirsty. Families pray, barter, dig deeper wells, and watch the sky with an almost religious devotion. Sometimes they move on, packing everything they own into a wagon and chasing rumors of better rain elsewhere. And sometimes they stay, not because it is easy, but because leaving feels like surrender. Food in times like these becomes both ritual and memory. Breakfast might be nothing more than hardtack, a dry flour-based biscuit that could last for months. Lunch, beans boiled again from last night. Supper, if you are lucky, a small piece of salted pork, tough but precious. Every bite is earned. Fresh vegetables are rare luxuries, and fruit rarer still. Many families went entire seasons without tasting anything sweet, relying on preserved jams or dried apples for comfort. Coffee was brewed again and again from the same grounds. People learned to stretch flavor the same way they stretched hope. But make no mistake, they did not see this as suffering. It was simply the rhythm of life. When food was scarce, neighbors shared. When the hunt failed, someone else offered what little they had. Communities survived because people understood that generosity was another kind of insurance. You gave today so you might receive tomorrow. The modern world measures wealth in money. The frontier measured it in abundance, not how much you had, but how long it could last. There is a story, often told in old diaries, of a family caught by an early snowstorm in the Dakotas. They had enough food for 4 weeks, but the storm lasted 6. When the father finally made it to the nearest town, he returned not with flour or meat, but with stories of other families doing the same thing, trading candles for potatoes, nails for sugar, books for beans. In those stories, everyone became a little richer. That was the quiet genius of frontier life, even when the land took everything. people kept creating meaning out of almost nothing. And still, they found beauty. After storms, the prairie glistened under the low sun like glass. In spring, the earth that once cracked open bloomed again with wildflowers, yellow, violet, and white, covering miles of land that just weeks ago had looked lifeless. The smell of new rain after months of dust was something no words could match. People wrote in their letters home, "It smelled like forgiveness." Every cycle, flood, frost, drought, renewal, reminded them that nature did not owe them comfort, but it offered rhythm. You could not control it, but you could live alongside it. You could learn its language. And perhaps that is what made the people of the frontier so extraordinary. They did not conquer the land, they negotiated with it, one season at a time. Their strength was not about dominance, but endurance. Their success was not in controlling nature, but in adapting to its moods. For all the hardship, there was also a strange peace in surrendering control, in knowing that no one truly mastered this land. Every sunrise brought both danger and promise, and that duality gave life its meaning. So as the wind fades and the prairie breathes again, you begin to see why people stayed. It was not comfort that anchored them. It was the quiet satisfaction of surviving one more day, the pride of looking at your small piece of land, battered, stubborn, alive, and saying, "We made it through." Maybe that is what the West was really about all along. Not gold, not fame, not endless freedom, but the patient art of enduring whatever the sky decided to give you. Because out here, every drop of rain was a story, and every sunrise was proof that you had earned another chance to tell it. When most people imagine the Wild West, they picture the towns first. A wide street lined with wooden buildings, horses tied outside, a saloon door swinging open, and a man in a hat squinting into the sunlight. It is an image burned into popular memory, neat, dramatic, full of tension and charm. But the real towns of the American frontier were not born of design. They were born of necessity. They did not appear slowly. They happened almost overnight. Wherever gold was found, or cattle routes crossed, or a new railroad stopped, people gathered. And from those gatherings, towns emerged like mirages, raw, temporary, and alive with noise and dust. If you had walked down the main street of a frontier town in the 1870s, the first thing you would notice was not the sound, it was the smell. The air was thick, with a mixture of things you could not escape: horse manure, smoke, whiskey, sweat, and dust that stuck to your skin like another layer of clothing. Every step stirred up a fine cloud from the dirt roads, and that same dust found its way everywhere into your food, your hair, and even the pages of your books. The streets had no pavement. After a rain, they turned into slow-moving rivers of mud. After a dry spell, they became choking fogs of grit. Women lifted their skirts high to keep them clean, and men carried extra handkerchiefs just to wipe their faces. And yet, people called these places progress. The wooden buildings leaned slightly, as if uncertain whether to stay standing. Saloons and general stores were the first to arrive, followed by a blacksmith, maybe a doctor. Then, if fortune smiled, a small school or church. But sanitation lagged behind ambition. Chamber pots emptied into alleys. Water was drawn from shallow wells that sat too close to where animals drank. Flies were everywhere, and with them came disease, the quiet killer that turned bustling settlements into ghost towns. Outbreaks of cholera, dysentery, and typhoid swept through like invisible storms. Doctors did what they could, but their tools were few: laudanum, quinine, and hope. People learned to fear the sound of coughing as much as the sound of gunfire. And yet, daily life continued with astonishing rhythm. Children ran barefoot through the same streets, chasing dogs and laughter. Merchants opened their shutters at dawn. A preacher might ring a bell from a borrowed building, calling whoever could hear to gather. In the midst of hardship, people kept building, and that, more than anything, was the true spirit of the West. The saloon, often painted as the heart of vice, was in truth a kind of social hub. It was where news arrived, deals were made, and travelers found a bed, a drink, or a song. Some served strong liquor cut with questionable ingredients. Others offered piano music and camaraderie that softened the edges of a long day. On some nights, the sound of laughter rose above the clatter of boots and glasses, a small rebellion against monotony. But for every joyful evening, there was tension brewing somewhere else. In the heat of summer, tempers rose faster than the temperature. Disagreements over cards, debts, or pride sometimes flared into brief violence, not the dramatic duels of the movies, but sudden, chaotic bursts that ended as quickly as they began. And yet, contrary to popular myth, most frontier towns were not lawless. Many had strict ordinances about weapons. In places like Dodge City or Tombstone, visitors were required to surrender their guns when they entered town limits. Peace was fragile enough without everyone carrying a loaded argument on their hip. Lawmen marshals, sheriffs, or sometimes just respected citizens kept order as best they could. They were not superheroes. They were human, overworked, underpaid, and constantly walking a line between keeping peace and keeping their lives. More often than not, real justice came from community pressure rather than the gun. People talk about the Wild West, but the truth is, most settlers wanted the opposite of wild. They wanted safety. They wanted structure, a place to trade, to raise families, to believe that tomorrow might look a little cleaner than today. That is why, even in the roughest towns, you would find sewing circles, school teachers, and Sunday gatherings. A woman might bake bread for her neighbors as a silent peace offering. A teacher might walk miles each morning to open a one-room schoolhouse filled with hand-me-down books. Small gestures built civilization one act at a time. And amid all this imperfection, there was an odd kind of beauty. The flicker of lanterns along a dusty street at dusk, the sound of a distant harmonica drifting through the evening air, the way people stopped everything to watch a sunset, as if reminded that no matter how rough life became, the world could still surprise them with color. If you stayed long enough in a frontier town, you would learn something subtle. It was not chaos that defined these places, it was persistence. The persistence to build homes in mud, to plant gardens in dust, to hold dances in barns, to celebrate small victories like the arrival of new mail or a clear morning after rain. In letters from the time, settlers often wrote about how, despite the hardship, they found themselves proud of their crooked fences, their patched roofs, their unsteady lives. Because every improvement, no matter how small, was proof that the wilderness could be tamed, not through conquest, but through care. So when we look at those famous images of the Old West, the poker tables, the swinging doors, the tense standoffs, we should remember the quieter truth that behind every dramatic legend was a community trying to make life normal. Behind every gun was a set of hands that also built, cooked, mended, and prayed. Behind every dusty street was a story of someone who stayed not for excitement, but for belonging. The real West was not wild because of its violence. It was wild because it was unfinished, constantly being built, rebuilt, and dreamed into being. It was a work in progress, full of imperfections and possibilities, stitched together by people who believed that even a rough beginning was worth something. In the end, those towns did not just survive on grit. They survived on hope, the kind that glows quietly, even in the dust. Night falls gently on the frontier, and inside a dimly lit cabin, the small flame of a lantern burns steady. It is a fragile light, and for many, it is the only kind they have, because in the 1870s American West, illness was not an event. It was a shadow, quiet, unpredictable, and often permanent. You could face drought, floods, or hunger, and still find ways to endure. But when sickness came, there was no guarantee of a tomorrow. Medicine, as we understand it now, barely existed. Doctors were few, and most towns were lucky to have one, sometimes a traveling physician who came through only once every few months. They carried what tools they could fit in a leather satchel, bottles of bitter tinctures, crude instruments, rolls of bandage, and faith that experience might be enough. Hospitals were rare, and when they did exist, they were closer to shelters than sanctuaries. Beds were shared, supplies reused, and sanitation was more hope than science. The germ theory of disease was still new, understood by a few, doubted by many. To most settlers, invisible causes seemed like superstition. Illness was explained as bad luck, bad air, or simply the will of God. If you fell ill, your care began and ended at home. Family members became nurses overnight. They boiled water, mixed herbal teas, prayed quietly. Sometimes it worked. Often it did not. And in those moments, silence filled the house in a way that words could not break. Frontier life left no margin for weakness. Even a small infection could become dangerous. A cut from a rusted tool, a broken bone, or a toothache could spiral into something fatal. People learned to live with pain as a kind of background noise, always there, rarely spoken of. Imagine being miles away from the nearest settlement when a fever strikes. There is no phone to call for help, no ambulance, no pharmacy. Someone saddles a horse and rides through the night, hoping the doctor is still in town or that he is not already left on another call. By the time help arrives, the outcome may already be decided. Yet, within this fragility, there was also incredible resilience. Communities learned to care for each other in ways modern life rarely requires. When a woman went into childbirth, neighbors gathered women, helping women, sharing knowledge passed down through generations. When someone was hurt, everyone came, men building fires for warmth, children fetching clean cloth, elders whispering advice. It was not perfect medicine, but it was human. And often, that was enough. The tools of healing were simple, clean water, herbal poultices, and thyme. Old remedies, willow bark for pain, honey for wounds, sage tea for sore throats, were passed between settlers, native tribes, and traveling healers. There was no competition between science and superstition here, only a shared goal: survival. Dentistry was its own quiet trial. There were no anesthetics, no polished chairs or bright lights. If a tooth went bad, it came out quickly, and usually without ceremony. People joked about it afterward, because humor softened what courage had already endured. But the greatest threat to life was not injury. It was childbirth. Women on the frontier gave birth at home, often without a trained midwife. Every delivery was an act of faith, and sometimes of sacrifice. Letters from the time speak of husbands sitting outside the door, hat in hand, praying not for riches or rain, but simply for the sound of a newborn cry. And when that cry finally came, it was music. It meant another small miracle had survived the odds. In a place where so much could go wrong, every birth was a declaration that life would continue no matter how hard the land tried to stop it. Of course, not every story ended with hope. Some illnesses had no cure. Pneumonia, dysentery, tuberculosis, words that meant waiting. People faced them with dignity, often writing letters or final notes while they still had strength. Not dramatic speeches, just simple lines, "Tell them I am at peace." Even in their last moments, many found comfort in the quiet, the same quiet that defined the world around them. The doctor's role, in truth, was less about saving lives and more about witnessing them. He was part healer, part counselor, part neighbor. He brought whatever comfort he could, a steady voice, a promise of effort, sometimes only presence. And when he rode away, lantern swinging from his saddle, it meant the night's work was done for better or worse. Yet, from all this fragility came a deeper kind of strength. People learned to measure life not in years but in seasons. They cherished health when they had it because they knew it might not last. A clear morning, a good meal, a pain-free breath, these were victories worth celebrating. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden in those dusty records and old journals. When everything is uncertain, gratitude becomes the purest medicine of all. In the evenings, when the wind outside grew cold and the cabin walls creaked like tired bones, families gathered around the fire. They told stories, sang hymns, read verses aloud. The warmth was not just physical, it was emotional, a reminder that they were still here together. And somehow, that knowledge carried them through what medicine could not. The West is often remembered for its courage, the duels, the outlaws, the bravery. But true courage was this: to keep living in a place where tomorrow was never guaranteed. To wake each day, knowing that the smallest accident or fever could change everything, and still choose to hope. So as we leave this small cabin tonight, let us take a moment to honor the quiet healers, the mothers, the midwives, the neighbors, who held hands through sleepless nights, who faced loss with grace, and who built a kind of faith stronger than science. Because long before there were hospitals or medicine, there was still care, and that was enough to keep humanity alive. The frontier was often called the land beyond the law. But that was not true, not really. It was not lawless. It was simply unfinished. And so, the people who lived there had to invent order from scratch. When we think of justice in the Old West, we picture dramatic standoffs, men facing each other in the street, hands hovering over their holsters, dust swirling around them like theater smoke. But in truth, that scene almost never happened. Real justice was quieter. Messier, human. A town might have one sheriff, one deputy, and an endless list of problems. They did not wear shining badges or carry perfect authority. Most were chosen by the townspeople themselves, ordinary men and women trying to hold together something fragile. They had no forensic science, no radios, no backup. All they had were instincts, notebooks, and community trust. The true weapon of law on the frontier was not a gun. It was reputation. If a sheriff was fair, people listened. If he was not, the town stopped trusting him, and law collapsed back into chaos. Every decision, every arrest, every warning, every compromise mattered. A single act of fairness could build peace. A single mistake could undo it. And yet, despite the challenges, most towns managed to stay calm. People wanted safety more than spectacle. They wanted rules they could rely on, not legends they could repeat. To understand how fragile this peace was, imagine a settlement of a few hundred people, farmers, traders, railroad workers, families. No courthouse, no jail yet, maybe just a small wooden building with a lock. When conflict arose over land, debt, or a stolen horse, it did not start with a gun. It started with words. Neighbors met to talk, to mediate, to vote. Justice was handmade. Like everything else, sometimes entire towns gathered to hold what they called People's Court. They listened, they argued, and they decided not by law books, but by what they believed was fair. The process was not perfect, but it reflected something remarkable. Even at the edge of civilization, people still believed in order. Of course, not every story ended so ideally. Sometimes emotion won over reason. Rumors spread faster than truth, and mobs formed before anyone could stop them. When fear and isolation mixed, judgment turned into punishment too quickly. Those were the moments that gave the frontier its darker legends, moments of haste, regret, and silence afterward. But those moments were exceptions, not the rule. Most of the time, peace was kept not by sheriffs or courts, but by shared understanding. Every town had its invisible code rules written not on paper, but in habit. Respect the land. Pay your debts. Mind your business, but help your neighbor when needed. People followed these rules, not because they were afraid of punishment, but because they could not afford chaos. Without order, trade stopped, crops rotted, and trust died. In larger towns, small courthouses began to appear. A judge might travel from settlement to settlement, carrying his law books in a trunk. He would hold sessions in schoolhouses, barns, or sometimes even under a tree. People gathered quietly, listening as he spoke about property, contracts, and right versus wrong. For many settlers, this was their first glimpse of formal justice, and it felt like a small piece of the East arriving in the wilderness. But the real architects of peace were often those who went unnoticed. Teachers who settled arguments among children before they grew into adult feuds, shopkeepers who extended credit rather than start fights, preachers who reminded people that forgiveness was also a kind of strength, women who nursed wounds, fed travelers, and kept communities talking when tempers rose. It is easy to think of justice as a courtroom drama, but here it was an everyday practice in tone, in gesture, in restraint. Even outlaws, those larger-than-life figures from dime novels, lived in a world of consequence. They were not untouchable. They relied on kindness from the same communities they defied, and many discovered that the land was less forgiving than any lawman. There is a kind of irony in it. The Wild West was less about violence and more about the fear of it. Everyone carried weapons, but few wanted to use them. Gunfire was loud, and loudness meant danger. Most settlers had already seen enough hardship. They craved silence more than spectacle. At night, the town grew still. The saloon lights dimmed, and the sound of boots on the boardwalk faded. Somewhere, a sheriff walked his final round hat low, lantern swinging. He was not looking for trouble. He was making sure none found its way in. If you looked closely, you might see a small sign nailed outside a store or church. Town ordinance. No firearms within limits. It was a quiet rebellion against the myth of chaos. People here did not want to live in a movie. They wanted to live And that is the part history often forgets: the incredible discipline it takes to keep peace without power. To face uncertainty, isolation, and danger, yet choose cooperation over fear. That is what true courage looked like on the frontier. Not a duel at high noon, but a handshake at dusk. Not the fastest draw, but the longest patience. The American West was never truly wild. It was human, unpredictable, flawed, hopeful. It was a place where people learned that justice is not about punishment. It is about preservation, preserving trust, preserving life, preserving the fragile idea that civilization, even in its roughest form, is worth the effort. So as the lantern light fades over that quiet street, remember that behind every story of outlaws and gunfights was 1,000 smaller acts of restraint. People choosing peace when they easily could have chosen otherwise. That, more than anything, is what kept the West alive long enough to become history. When you picture the Wild West, who do you see? Maybe a white cowboy with a wide-brimmed hat riding across an open plain. That is the image we were given. Neat, heroic, simple. But the real West was far from simple. It was a mosaic, a landscape of many faces, languages, and dreams, stitched together under one vast sky. Long before the railroads and wagon trains arrived, this land already had nations ancient, complex, deeply rooted: the Navajo, Lakota, Apache, Cheyenne, Nez Perce, and dozens more, each with their own laws, stories, and sacred places. They did not discover the land, they belonged to it. To them, every river, mountain, and animal carried meaning. When settlers came, they brought a new rhythm: fences, borders, maps. The earth that once belonged to everyone became something to claim, buy, and sell. It was not just a change in territory, it was a change in worldview. To the native peoples, land was like air shared, not owned. To the newcomers, land was opportunity, something to conquer and control. Between those two ideas, a great misunderstanding began, and that misunderstanding would shape centuries. Yet, the story of the West is not just about conflict. It is also about exchange. Native knowledge of weather, water, plants, and navigation often saved settlers' lives. Many frontiersmen learned survival skills directly from indigenous guides. They borrowed moccasins for silent travel, snowshoes for winter, herbal medicine for wounds. Every settlement that survived owed part of its endurance to wisdom far older than itself. But as more settlers came, space shrank and promises broke. Treaties signed in ink were erased by greed and expansion. And slowly, entire nations were forced to move, often to lands too dry to farm, too far from their sacred roots. Children were taken to boarding schools, their hair cut, their language forbidden. The intent was to make them forget who they were. But memory is stubborn. It survived in stories whispered, songs remembered, dances carried out under starlight. Even when history tried to erase them, culture endured. Beyond the native nations, the West was home to a mix of people as vast as its horizon. After the Civil War, thousands of Black Americans moved west, seeking freedom, safety, and a chance to build lives away from prejudice. They became farmers, ranchers, soldiers, and cowboys. In fact, historians now estimate that nearly 1 in 4 cowboys were black. Yet their names rarely appear in old stories. They worked the same trails, slept under the same stars, and faced the same dangers as any man on horseback. But their legacy was largely left out of the picture. Still, they left their mark in place names, in ranch traditions, in songs that traveled from campfire to campfire. Their courage was not about duels or fame. It was about building something in a world that often refused to see them. Further west, another group was building the backbone of the continent, the Chinese laborers. They came in the mid-1800s, drawn by gold and by promises of work. When others left the dangerous railroad tunnels, they stayed. They blasted through granite, laid tracks through the mountains, and connected a nation that barely acknowledged them. They earned half the wages of white workers, lived in tents or dugouts, and sent their pay back home across the ocean. When the railroads were done, many turned to laundry, farming, or small trades. Quiet, persistent work that built communities from dust. Yet, despite their contribution, discrimination was severe. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act became the first U.S. law to bar immigration based on nationality. Entire Chinatowns were burned, and families were driven away. But still, they rebuilt patient as water, enduring as stone. Their temples, gardens, and recipes remained small anchors of belonging in a land that often called them foreign. Then there were the Mexican families, the Tejanos, Californios, and Nuevo Mexicanos, whose roots in the region ran deeper than the U.S. itself. They had lived here for generations before the border ever shifted. Their architecture, ranching styles, music, and traditions blended seamlessly into the land. But when maps changed, their ownership was questioned. Courts written in a new language overturned deeds written in the old one. Bit by bit, land passed from their hands into the hands of others. Still, they stayed, teaching, trading, adapting, adding their rhythm to the great Western song. Immigrants from across Europe, Germans, Irish, Italians, Scandinavians followed, each bringing something unique. They built barns that looked like the ones from their homelands, cooked bread that smelled of old kitchens, and sang songs of faraway mountains. They came chasing hope, but what they built was identity, a strange new blend that became the American West. Walk through a frontier town at sunset, and you might hear a dozen languages in the air. English, mixed with Spanish, Chinese, Lakota, German, all carried on the same dry wind. In that sense, the West was not a single story. It was a conversation rough at times, unfair at others, but undeniably shared. Of course, this diversity did not erase prejudice. Racism, exploitation, and inequality ran deep, but side by side, in fields and railroads and ranches, people learned something they might not have learned anywhere else. That survival does not care about language or color. A snowstorm does not ask your name before it freezes you. A drought does not check your accent before it cracks your crops. In hardship, cooperation was not idealism. It was necessity. And from that necessity grew a new kind of unity, fragile, imperfect, but real. It was not built on flags or laws, but on the small kindnesses that keep people alive. Sharing food, lending tools, singing songs together when work was done. That was the true multicultural frontier. Not a melting pot, but a campfire where everyone added their own warmth. So when we think of the American West, we should not see one face or one voice. We should see thousands, each carrying a story, each carving a path through hardship toward belonging. Together, they built something bigger than any single dream. And though history often remembers their struggles more than their successes, the truth remains. The West was never a single color, creed, or language. It was and still is a chorus. The American frontier was not won with speed or glory. It was built slowly, by tired hands, on land that gave nothing easily. The West was not kind to dreamers, but it rewarded those who endured. By the 1870s, the age of adventure had shifted into the age of survival. Gold rush towns that once glittered with promise now echoed with pickaxes and coughs. The miners came first, chasing rumors of silver, gold, and copper buried beneath endless rock. They dug through mountain veins and riverbeds, chasing fortune in the earth itself. Some struck luck. Most struck dust. Mining was a world of danger, dressed as opportunity. A man might spend 12 hours underground, swinging a hammer in air so thick with dust it burned his throat. The tunnels were dark, the supports weak, the pay uncertain. Explosions from careless blasting tore through the earth and through men. When the lamps went out, they did not always come back on. But people kept digging because hope is heavier than stone. Every strike, every rumor drew more settlers west. Mining camps became towns, towns became cities. And though the gold ran out, the people stayed. They built schools where shafts once opened, churches where bars had stood, and homes where tents had blown away in the wind. Those who did not dig turned to the surface. The plains stretched endlessly, flat as the ocean, and the government offered land through the Homestead Act. 160 acres free, if you could survive on it for 5 years. It sounded generous. It was a test. The soil was stubborn, the weather merciless. In the East, a farmer could rely on rain. In the West, rain was a rumor. Crops failed, wells dried, and winds carried dust that settled on every plate, every bed, every breath. But people persisted. They plowed, planted, and prayed. Children fetched water from miles away. Women worked fields beside their husbands, mending fences and spirits at the same time. When a storm came, families gathered in silence and listened as nature reminded them who ruled this land. The houses they built were not made of wood. On the treeless plains, there was nothing to cut. So they built from what they had, earth itself. Blocks of sod, cut and stacked like bricks, became walls. Inside, the air was cool and damp, the ceilings low, the insects constant. Yet these sod houses stood strong against wind that could strip bark from trees. Crude, yes, but they were proof of invention born from need. Every life here was a trade between risk and endurance. The ranchers learned this too. Cattle drives stretched for weeks, herding thousands of animals across rivers and plains. A sudden storm could scatter them into chaos. Stampedes flattened everything in their path. And still the ranchers followed, calm and steady, guiding the herds through miles of wilderness toward rail lines that waited to carry them east. Cowboys were not the myth Hollywood painted them to be. They were workers tired, underpaid, often young. They mended fences, calmed frightened animals, and slept under open skies. Their days began before sunrise and ended long after the stars appeared. They ate beans, biscuits, and dust. Many were black, Mexican or native, fluent in silence and skill. They did not chase fame. They chased a living. Every trade in the frontier carried its price. Miners lost their lungs to dust. Farmers lost their backs to labor. Ranchers lost their hearing to the wind. But all of them gained something intangible, a fierce sense of purpose. They worked, because to stop was to surrender. In time, small towns began to bloom between vast stretches of wilderness. A general store appeared, Then a post office, a blacksmith, a school. Children studied by lantern light. Letters from the East arrived months late, but were read over and over until the paper tore. Every word from home was a promise that they had not been forgotten. Isolation, however, was relentless. Winter could trap families for weeks behind snowdrifts higher than their roofs. Summer could burn the crops before they ripened. When sickness came, there was no doctor within days' ride. People relied on each other. A neighbor's knock on the door was as vital as medicine, and when someone fell ill, the entire settlement paused, because survival was never personal, it was collective. Despite everything, there was beauty in the routine. The first smell of bread baking after a storm, the sound of boots on dry earth when spring finally returned, a child's laughter echoing across empty fields, small moments that reminded them why they stayed. The frontier changed those who survived it. It stripped away pride and comfort, but it built resilience in their place. It taught that hope was not something you waited for. It was something you made, brick by brick, harvest by harvest, day by day. The legends of cowboys and gunslingers may have captured the imagination, but the true story of the West was quieter. It was about the miner who went back underground after losing a friend because his family needed the pay, the farmer who replanted for the 5th time, knowing the rain might never come, the woman who kept her family alive through ingenuity alone. It was about ordinary endurance, repeated until it became extraordinary. By the 1880s, railroads cut across the plains, and progress followed the tracks. The old isolation began to fade, but those who had lived through the emptiness never forgot it. They carried it in their silence, in their habits, in their patience. The West they built was not glamorous. It was honest, a place where every meal, every wall, every morning was earned. When we look back now, it is easy to see only the hardship, but beneath it all was a quiet kind of triumph, the proof that even in the harshest land, people can build a life out of dust and persistence. The West began as silence. Then came the faint sound of metal, the first whisper of the railroad, and nothing would ever be the same. Again, before the iron tracks, time moved slowly. A letter could take months. A journey might take seasons. The land was measured in days of travel, not in miles. But when the railroads arrived, they carried more than trains. They brought speed, commerce, noise, and the idea that even the farthest edge of the map could be reached. The first tracks crossed the plains like dark lines of ambition. Surveyors walked ahead, marking routes through mountain passes and deserts that seemed endless. Behind them came crews of workers, Chinese, Irish, Mexican, black freedmen. Thousands of men laying iron by hand, one spike at a time. They slept in tents, ate from tin pans, and worked from dawn until exhaustion turned their muscles to stone. It was dangerous work. Explosions, cave-ins, and heat claimed lives quietly. But when two great lines, one from the east, one from the west, finally met in 1869 at Promontory Summit, Utah, the world changed. That single moment connected the continent. What had once taken months by wagon could now be crossed in a week, and with that connection, the Wild West began to fade not suddenly but steadily, like the last light before night. Trains did not just move people, they moved civilization itself. Wood, bricks, glass, machines, all the materials of progress arrived by rail. Towns that had been isolated now had access to goods from thousands of miles away. A homesteader could order a sewing machine, a farmer could sell his wheat to a city, and a miner could send ore to a factory he would never see. The frontier, for the first time, felt less like a world apart and more like a piece of something whole. But the railroad also changed the rhythm of life in ways that could not be undone. The sound of the train became the new heartbeat of the West. Every whistle meant connection mail arriving, visitors returning, or new settlers stepping into the unknown. Every departure carried stories away and brought others in. The vast silence of the plains began to hum with possibility. Around the rail lines, new towns appeared almost overnight. They started as small stations, a water tower, a depot, a few tents. Then came hotels, stores, saloons, and post offices. Soon, those temporary settlements became permanent cities. Denver, Cheyenne, Albuquerque, and countless others grew along the tracks, each one born from the same iron veins that stitched the nation together. Yet progress always had two faces. For every opportunity it brought, the railroad also took something away. Buffalo herds that once stretched for miles were driven to near extinction. The open lands of native tribes were cut apart by boundaries they never agreed to. Old trails disappeared beneath steel, and the wilderness grew smaller with every passing year. The West, once endless, was now mapped, fenced, and timed by train schedules. Technology kept reshaping life in ways people barely understood. Telegraph lines ran alongside the rails, carrying words faster than any horse could run. A message that once took weeks could now cross the continent in minutes. Farmers began using new tools: reapers, windmills, mechanical plows that turned harsh land into fields of grain. Even photography arrived, freezing the faces of settlers, miners, and towns that otherwise would have vanished into memory. The image of the cowboy, the miner, the pioneer, these were no longer just people. They became symbols, captured in photographs, newspapers, and traveling shows that toured the country. The myth of the West began while the real West was still alive. People in New York or London could look at those images and imagine a world of dust, courage, and freedom, not realizing how much struggle stood behind the picture. But for those still living there, the transformation was personal. The trains brought strangers, investors, politicians, land agents, men in fine coats who saw the land as profit rather than home. Speculation rose. Land changed hands faster than people could build fences. Ranchers and farmers began to clash over space. Barbed wire, invented in 1874, ended the era of open range. What had once been shared became enclosed. Freedom began to look smaller, more organized, more civilized, and perhaps less alive. Yet, not all change was loss. Education spread. Libraries appeared in small towns. Women's organizations and newspapers grew in number. Ideas traveled faster than wagons ever could. The railroad did not just carry goods, it carried the future. And the future, once unimaginable, began to take root in the dry soil of the West. A man born in 1850 could have watched the land transform before his eyes. He might have crossed it by wagon in his youth, hearing only wind and coyotes. By his middle age, he could sit on a train, sipping coffee from a porcelain cup, watching telegraph poles flicker by in perfect rhythm. The world he knew was gone, replaced by something faster, louder, and more connected, both wonderful and unfamiliar. By the 1890s, the last frontiers had been mapped, and the census declared the frontier closed. But that was not true. The frontier did not end. It simply moved from land to mind, from survival to ambition, from wilderness to invention. The same restless spirit that had driven people westward now drove them toward new ideas, new technologies, new worlds. The railroad was the symbol of that transformation. It was not just a machine. It was a declaration that even the most distant horizon could be reached if you were willing to lay the track. The sound of its whistle was not only progress, it was memory. It reminded people where they had come from and how much they had changed to get here. So when we think of the West, we should remember that its story did not end when the trains arrived. It evolved. The same determination that built cabins in dust now built cities of stone and steel. The same courage that crossed rivers now crossed industries and inventions. And though the open plains grew quieter, the echo of that journey still runs beneath every mile of track. The West was no longer wild, but it was still alive, transformed, connected, and forever moving forward. When the last rail was laid and the last homestead fenced, the West did not disappear. It simply changed shape. The land became history, and history became a story. A story told, retold, and finally reinvented until the truth was nearly unrecognizable. The people who had lived through it were still alive, still working, still growing old. But somewhere between their worn hands and the printed page, the West began to turn into something else. It became legend. The first storytellers were not filmmakers or novelists. They were the people themselves, miners who exaggerated their luck, cowhands who enlarged their adventures, travelers who wanted their hardships to sound heroic. In a place where survival was daily and dull, a touch of drama made life sound bigger than it felt. A man who dug for years without finding gold might tell his grandchildren that he nearly struck a fortune. A cowboy who broke horses might remember himself as a hero who tamed the wilderness. No one corrected them. The truth was heavy. Stories were lighter. Then came the dime novels, cheap, thrilling, printed by the thousands. Writers back east, who had never seen a cactus or crossed a prairie, began spinning tales of brave lawmen, daring outlaws, and uncharted lands filled with danger and glory. They took names from real people, Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, Calamity Jane, and reshaped them into characters. In their pages, the West became clean and dramatic, filled with duels, rescues, and moral certainty. There was always a villain, always a hero, always a clear ending. It was everything the real West had never been. People devoured those stories. For a few cents, they could escape to a place where courage always won, and justice always arrived on time. They could forget that the real frontier had been slow, muddy, uncertain, and full of gray areas. The printed myth was simpler, easier to love, easier to sell. When photography arrived, the image joined the myth. Old gunfighters posed for studio portraits with borrowed weapons, wearing cleaner clothes than they ever had in life. Traveling shows began touring cities across America and Europe. The most famous of them all, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, turned history into theater. Cowboys, Native Americans, trick riders, and sharpshooters performed battles that had been rewritten for applause. Audiences cheered, believing they were watching truth, but they were seeing nostalgia, a dream painted over the past. As decades passed, the stories became fixed in memory. The West of struggle and survival gave way to the West of courage and romance. It was easier to celebrate the hero than to face the cost of progress, the displaced tribes, the vanished bison, the exhausted miners, the forgotten laborers. The myth needed clear lines. History had none. By the early 20th century, the West was reborn again, this time on film. The silent era began with grainy riders galloping across white screens, and soon the Western became America's favorite genre. The world learned the West not through diaries or letters, but through the faces of actors under perfect sunsets. The camera added wind and music where once there had been only exhaustion. It turned hardship into spectacle and silence into dialogue. And yet, even in its falsehood, the myth did something important. It gave meaning to a century of endurance. For a nation growing fast, full of machines and cities, the image of the cowboy reminded people of simplicity, bravery, and open space. It became a mirror for what they wanted to believe about themselves, self-reliant, just, and free. But truth never disappears completely. If you look closely, beneath the layers of fiction, you can still see it faint, steady, unembellished. In old letters written by lamplight, in photographs of weathered faces, in journals that smell of smoke and ink, the real West still speaks. It does not shout, it whispers. And its story is quieter, harder, but far more human. It tells of children who fell asleep to the sound of coyotes instead of lullabies, of women who mended clothes from flour sacks and sang to keep from crying, of men who buried tools beside friends and went back to work because there was no other choice. It tells of strength that never asked for attention, of communities that built a nation not with legends, but with labor. The myth of the West promised excitement. The truth of the West delivered endurance. One entertained the world, the other built it. Over time, the two began to blend. History museums filled with artifacts beside movie posters. Tourists stood on wooden sidewalks, rebuilt for effect, taking photos where once real families had lived and died. In a strange way, the myth preserved what time might have erased. Without the stories, even the false ones, the memory might have faded completely. The danger was not in telling the stories. It was in forgetting they were stories. Every myth begins with truth. It only loses meaning when we stop asking what lies beneath it. Today, when people visit the old town's Dodge City, Deadwood, Tombstone, they walk through two worlds at once. The one built by imagination and the one built by sweat. You can still feel both. The wooden boards creak beneath your feet, and for a moment you can almost hear the echo of the real lives that once filled this place. The cough of miners, the cry of cattle, the laughter after hard days. Reality, though quieter, still lingers. The myth made the West immortal, but the truth makes it human. And perhaps that is the better ending, because the real miracle of the frontier was never the gunfights or the gold rush. It was that, out of wilderness and struggle, people built a world that could remember them at all. The West, in the end, was not just a place. It was an idea, one that still rides beneath the stories, reminding us that progress is built by hands that seldom make it into legend. The frontier may have vanished from maps, but it never left the mind of America. Its echo lingers in the way people talk about freedom, work, and destiny. The West was never just geography. It was belief that beyond every horizon, something better waited. That idea became a kind of inheritance. Children grew up hearing stories of ancestors who had crossed rivers, climbed mountains, or survived winters with almost nothing, even if the stories were polished smooth by time. The lesson stayed rough and true. Keep going. That was the real gift of the frontier, not gold or land, but endurance. It taught that success was rarely handed down. It was carved out, one stubborn day at a time. In the early 20th century, that spirit turned industrial. The same ambition that once drove wagon trains now built factories, bridges, and skyscrapers. Men who might have swung pickaxes in mines now riveted steel hundreds of feet in the air. The roar of trains became the hum of engines. The dream of westward expansion turned inward toward invention and progress. And yet, the old restlessness remained. People kept moving to new cities, new technologies, new frontiers of science and thought. Each age found its own wilderness to explore. The frontier changed shape from land to industry to space to the digital world, but the feeling stayed the same. The belief that something greater was waiting, if only you had the courage to chase it. Still, the memory of the original West carried contradictions. The same courage that tamed a continent also caused loss and displacement. The freedom celebrated by settlers often came at the expense of those already here. And while the myth of self-reliance became central to American identity, it sometimes forgot the truth that no one truly survived alone. The frontier thrived on community, neighbors who shared food, strangers who became friends, families who built towns together. Individual strength mattered, but shared endurance mattered more. Those contradictions still live quietly in modern life. Every ideal carries its shadow. The love of independence can slip into isolation. The pursuit of opportunity can turn into competition. The desire for freedom can forget responsibility. The real lesson of the frontier is not endless conquest, it is balance. Freedom, yes, but also the humility to know that no one owns the horizon. As the country grew, the landscape changed faster than memory could follow. Cities spread over the old trails. Highways replaced wagon ruts. Rivers once forded by horses were now crossed by bridges and power lines. But even among the lights and noise, something of the old silence remained. It lived in the wide skies of the plains, the wind that still whispered across forgotten farms, the open roads that seemed to go on forever. People still chase that silence, whether in travel, art, or solitude, because somewhere deep inside, the spirit of the frontier still calls, a longing for space, for possibility, for something unclaimed. Modern life may be full of screens and speed, but the desire behind it is ancient, the same longing that drove wagons west. The American identity, for better or worse, was built on that motion, always expanding, always chasing the next horizon. It created innovation, discovery, and progress. It also created impatience, the quiet fear that staying still means falling behind. That tension defines the country even now, bold and restless, inventive and uncertain, always building, always leaving. The legacy of the frontier is visible in small things too. In the value placed on hard work, in the admiration for people who start with nothing and make something lasting, in the belief that limits exist only to be tested, and in the quiet respect for those who endure, even when no one is watching. But perhaps the most powerful inheritance of the frontier is hope. Not the loud, easy kind, but the quiet one that survives disappointment. The hope that kept families alive through winters, miners working through darkness, settlers planting again after drought. That hope built railroads, schools, and cities. It built the belief that effort itself has worth, even when results are uncertain. It built a culture that, at its best, believes in possibility. Of course, the myth and the truth of the West will always coexist. The myth gave the world heroes. The truth gave it humanity. One made people dream. The other made them endure. Together, they formed the story America still tells about itself, a story both proud and unfinished. Because the frontier never really ended, it just moved. Today, it is not a wilderness of land, but of ideas, new science, new art, new understanding. Each generation inherits the same challenge: to go forward without forgetting what came before, to chase progress without losing empathy, to seek freedom without losing connection, to expand outward, yes, but also inward, towards self-knowledge. If the old pioneers could see the world now, they might not recognize the machines or the cities, but they would recognize the restlessness. They would see it in the skyscrapers that rise like mountains, the satellites orbiting like stars, the explorers who still look up and wonder what lies beyond. That curiosity, that refusal to stop moving, that is the last campfire of the frontier still burning. In the end, the true inheritance of the West is not land or legend, but perspective. It reminds us that civilization is fragile and that progress always costs something. It asks that we remember the hands that built from nothing, the voices that were silenced, and the courage that endured without applause. The West began as wilderness. Then it became work. Then it became memory. And now it lives as a mirror, showing both what people achieved and what they lost along the way. The frontier may be gone, but the longing for it never fades. It waits quietly, just beyond reach, whispering the same promise it always did. There is more ahead if you are brave enough to look for it. History has a way of fading gently, like twilight. One moment it is vivid, full of sound and struggle, and the next it softens into memory. So it was with the American frontier. The guns, the gold, the dust, the courage, all of it sank slowly beneath the passing years, until only echoes remained. But those echoes never truly vanished. They became part of something larger, a way of thinking, a way of imagining life. Every generation since has carried a piece of that horizon inside them, even if they have never seen it. The West, at its heart, was never about a direction on a compass. It was about movement, outward, forward, onward. It was the belief that something beyond the next hill might change everything. And so people kept walking. They left behind the familiar, the safe, and the known, carrying with them little more than hope and stubbornness. It is easy now to look back and see only the myth, the clean lines, the heroism, the romance. But behind every story there were years of labor, of disappointment, of endurance that rarely made it into print. The West was not a story of victory. It was a story of survival, a story of people learning how to live with uncertainty, with loneliness, with the raw, unforgiving rhythm of the land. And yet from that hardship grew something extraordinary: resilience. The settlers did not conquer nature. They adapted to it. They built homes from dirt, carved wells through rock, and learned to read the weather as if it were a living book. They turned isolation into community, scarcity into creativity, and failure into another kind of success. The quiet kind that means you are still here when the sun rises again. That spirit never disappeared. You can still feel it in the pulse of modern life, in every builder, every dreamer, every person who looks at the unknown and says, "I will try." The tools have changed. The horizon has shifted, but the feeling is the same. It is the hum of the old world beneath the noise of the new. The frontier teaches something that no book or law can capture: that progress is never permanent, and civilization is always fragile. Every fence that went up on the plains was also a reminder of how temporary control really is. Every town that vanished back into dust proved that nothing human lasts forever. And yet, people kept building anyway. They knew their work might fade, but they built it because they were alive. That alone was reason enough, in a way that is the truest legacy of the frontier: not expansion, not empire, not even freedom, but persistence. The simple act of continuing, no matter what the sky looks like, that is what made the old pioneers remarkable. Not their guns or their legends, but their quiet refusal to stop. It is tempting to think of the frontier as something that ended when the maps filled in and the railroads met, but it did not end. It just changed form. Today, the frontier lies in different places: in the ocean depths, in the stars above, in the digital world that connects us across invisible lines. It lives in invention, in exploration, in the questions people still ask when they look toward the unknown. Every scientist, every artist, every wanderer still hears the same silent invitation: go further. And if the old settlers could return for a single moment, perhaps they would understand this age better than we think. They would recognize the same impatience, the same hope, the same restless desire to reach something beyond the horizon. They would see that their spirit survived not in the land, but in the will of those who keep searching. What they might not recognize is how easy forgetting has become. The world moves faster now. We pass over history as if it were scenery interesting, but distant. We forget that every comfort we have was built from someone's discomfort, every safety from someone's risk. The story of the West reminds us to look back with humility, because every step forward once cost someone else a struggle. If there is a lesson to take from the old frontier, it is this: that progress is not measured in conquest, but in compassion. That freedom means little without responsibility. That courage is quieter than we imagine, more about endurance than about glory. And that every generation, in its own way, must decide what kind of world it will build from the wilderness it inherits. Perhaps that is why the West still captures imagination. It is not because it was perfect, but because it was human. It was a vast experiment in what people can do when they have almost nothing but will. It showed how fragile hope can be, and how stubborn it remains, even when everything else falls away. The open land is smaller now. The sky is crossed with wires, the plains with roads, the rivers with bridges. But if you stand in the quiet places, the empty deserts, the old trails, the ruins of towns swallowed by time, you can still feel it. The hush before sunrise, the wind moving through grass that has never been owned, the faint sense that something larger is watching, waiting, listening. The frontier is not gone. It is simply everywhere. It lives in the way people keep searching for meaning, for belonging, for something just beyond reach. It lives in the courage to begin again and again, even when the world feels finished. So, as the story closes, imagine one last evening on that vast horizon. The air cools. The light fades. Somewhere, a lantern flickers in a window, a small flame against an endless dark. It burns not for conquest, but for memory, for the simple truth that every beginning, every journey, every dream starts the same way, with one step into the unknown, and perhaps that is how it will always be. The frontier never ends. It only waits for those still brave enough to look toward it and keep walking. And so, our journey through the true West comes to an end. From the first lonely cabins built out of earth and wind, to the cities of iron and glass that rose in their place, the story of the frontier has always been more than a tale of land. It is a story of people ordinary, flawed, resilient, who shaped a wilderness, and in doing so shaped themselves. We have seen how they worked, loved, lost, and endured. How they faced storms without shelter, sickness without medicine, and solitude without surrender. We have followed their footsteps across deserts and mountains, through hunger, through silence, through years that asked for everything they had, and we have watched how the West, little by little, transformed from a harsh landscape into a living idea, because the West was never just a place. It was and still is a mirror that shows us who we are when comfort falls away. It asks what we cling to when there is nothing left but sky and dust. And it reminds us that courage is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet, patient, persistent. It is the steady light that keeps burning even when no one sees it. Today, the prairies are quieter. The trails have faded. But the spirit that once built barns, schools, and dreams from nothing still lives on in every person who dares to start over, to build again, to keep moving forward even when the road is uncertain. The frontier still whispers to us, just in new languages, invention, imagination, discovery. It tells us that the horizon is never truly reached. It only moves as we do. So as we close this story tonight, take one last look toward that endless sky. The stars above are the same ones they once followed, cold, distant, beautiful, and eternal. And maybe, as you drift into rest, you will feel what they once felt, that quiet mix of exhaustion and hope, the simple peace of having come this far, and the promise that tomorrow the world begins again. Thank you for traveling through history with me, for listening, for imagining, for remembering. Until next time, may your road be gentle, your nights calm, and your spirit always a little bit wild. Good night. Crescent moon.